Singapore, largest port in the world, in a city-state barely larger than Toronto. Since its independence from Malaysia in 1965, which had in turn obtained its independence from the British 2 years earlier, it has experienced the fastest growth in Asia and one of the fastest in the world. Consisting of 64 islands, the archipelago was still covered with small wooden houses only 50 years ago. Today, the city is short on space, despite its numerous high-rises. To compensate, it is constantly expanding on the water.
Essentially, everything from that road all the way through down south are land that didn't exist before.
But everything here is done in a sustainable way to ensure the proliferation of the rainforest.
They really want to build a city in a garden, even downtown, where the land is very expensive.
90% of Singapore's population live in HDBs, social housing projects very different from the ones we know. And even though the city is known for its strict regulations, life here is pleasant and peaceful, carefully structured for the greater good.
Actually, you can buy gum in Singapore.
Really?
For medical reasons.
Journalist Marion Zipfel specializes in Asian culture. She gives me a roundup of the elements that make up daily life in her adoptive city.
We are at Marina Bay, so the new iconic place of Singapore.
Is there such a thing as a Singaporean? Because people here seem to be from everywhere else in the world.
I guess that's the thing of Singapore, is like Singapore is like a ethnical puzzle, and you have Indians, you have Chinese, you have Malay, and you have what we call Eurasian, which was a mix of Asian and European. And I guess that's all what Singapore is about, is having an ethnic population and trying to make it as a Singaporean people. That's the biggest challenge. Multiculturalism is a very difficult issue, and if you look how it goes, to me it worked. And what's interesting is you see that also for religion, you would celebrate Christmas, and then you'll see the lights for Chinese New Year, and all year long you'll see the different light on Orchard Road. People can live in harmony. Of course, it is well organized, and the government is the watchdog of this, but see, it's working.
Singapore's unparalleled economic growth has created a solid social structure. Unemployment here is practically non-existent. In fact, labor is in such demand that foreign workers are brought in by the thousands.
I'm sure you've seen those 3 towers. What's really in is the casino, of course. That's what is supposed to attract most visitors and to make tourism one of the new business orientation of Singapore. I mean, casino was forbidden in Singapore. But then the government realized that there were lots of money to do on that. So they said, okay, sorry for that. We'll cover it up, and everybody is very happy with the casino now. The funny thing of it is basically you see the hotel. Inside there is the casino, but we don't see the casino.
Largest hotel in Singapore, the Marina Bay Sands clearly illustrates the city's audacity. Designed by Canadian architect Moshe Safdie, creator of Habitat 67 in Montreal, it is by far the most expensive hotel project in the world. Its total cost, including the land it sits on, $8 billion. The Sands is simply surreal. 2,600 rooms on 55 floors in 3 imposing towers. 10,000 employees, 2 theaters, a museum, and countless restaurants created by world-class chefs. But the highlight of the Sands is without a doubt its roof. A phenomenal 340-meter park, large enough for 3,900 people, with a very unique pool that seems to spill onto the city.
You can say that the population consists of lots of polyglots.
They speak English, they speak Chinese. I mean, it depends of their ethnic groups. But what they speak the most is what we call the Singlish. I'm sure you've heard about it, like this mix of English, which apparently isn't by your grammar, and also it's basically the translation of Chinese sentence into English, which makes, for example, very easy things. Can you do this or you can't do this? You just say can if you can, or cannot if you cannot. You don't need to say, no, I cannot do this because blah, blah, blah. No, no, no. You go easy, can or cannot. Or you also have this sentence to say, yes, I'm heading first, I'm going, okay, I'm leaving. You say, I go first. It's very badly taken by the government because according to the government, it gives a bad image of Singapore. You can see on the website you have a do not speak Singlish movement and so on. Because people were very angry about this. They do protect our Singlish movement. So there was it was funny, like people also wanted to protect their Singlish, which is also part of the Singapore identity. So they want to protect their Singlish.
In any case, Singlish provides a connection that wouldn't otherwise exist between the different ethnicities that make up the local population. To show me firsthand the extent of Singapore's diversity, Marion takes me for a Sunday walk in Little India.
It's not that little, but if you look at Singapore, Singapore is not that big anyway. Little India is kind of a main ethnic area in Singapore, and as you can see, we look like we are in another city now. People used to say that Little India is more Indian than India, because sometimes when you go out of your country, you tend to be more conservative on your values and background. Today is Sunday. You see mainly men. It's their day off, so they're doing basically everything they need to do during the weeks. So they would gather to eat, they would send money back home, and they would do their shopping and look around. We are basically the only women there. These men are alone, and they send all the money back to the family. It's quite common here in Singapore to have people that come and work to send money back home. Like you have the Indians, but you also have the Filipinos. But definitely, it's a men's world here.
Yeah, we definitely are in the minority.
We are. Look around and. Oh my gosh!
These precious photos are in fact the only link with their families. The majority of these men return home only once a year. The Port of Singapore is clearly the secret of its success. This is partly because it has short-circuited Malaysia's maritime trade by offering free access to ships in transit. It has now become the hub of petroleum in the Western world without ever being involved in its production. Each year, it competes for the title of world's largest port with Shanghai. The port is also the entry point for the majority of goods consumed locally. There's just about no agriculture here. The place is simply too small. Singapore imports many things from many places, the most impressive being 250,000 kilos of live pigs each day. Chua Ben Huat is head of the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore.
The interesting thing about the port is that even though it's a very big harbor, it doesn't employ a lot of Singaporeans because of the high mechanization. So as a result, the harbor is not in the mind of Singaporeans very often.
But it's number one
In transportation, yeah.
in volume.
That's right. But a lot of it is transshipment. Singapore population is about 5 million, so the consumption is not that high. So the port is really just a hub, and things don't stay very long.
How did Singapore become such an important transportation hub?
Part of it is actually intentional development plan, but part of it is actually geographical location, because from Europe going to China and Japan, you have to pass through Singapore.
I don't feel like we're in a university campus. I feel like we're in the jungle.
Yes, actually, this Singapore is consciously green. The idea is that pleasant environment is actually helpful to productivity. So it's a very conscious process. A lot of the cities are now trying to copy the greening of the city.
It seems that life is so good here that it compensates for the fact that it is so highly regulated.
I actually don't think that there is that much that you cannot do in Singapore.
You don't sell gum in Singapore.
That's an interesting one. Actually, you can buy gum in Singapore
Really?
for medical reasons. Yes, you don't. And actually, you can chew gum in Singapore.
You just can't
cannot
spit
buy
it out.
You cannot buy it.
What happens if you spit it out?
If you spit it out, you will just be caught as littering, and then you'll probably be fined a small sum of money. But more importantly, you will be asked to do street cleaning work with bright orange jackets to tell the world that you have been a litter bug. But actually, it's not a very big problem. Chewing gum is not a Singaporean practice anyway. But the government's position is that even though it is very hard to enforce, right, the law makes a statement about values symbolically. So it's the same about Singapore law on pornography on the internet. Basically, it knows that it can never police the internet, but it bans certain explicit sites like Hustler, Playboy, and all that, just to make a symbolic statement.
The regulations are imposed to ensure the well-being of all. And if the city is so clean and free of traffic jams, it's precisely because of strict controls over the quantity of cars.
Cars are very expensive in Singapore, right? Because of the desire to control car population. A car in Singapore probably costs about 3 times more than in Canada. Before you can buy a car, you must buy a certificate that entitles you to buy a car. The number of certificates available every month is calculated on the basis of how many cars are on the road and how many have been retired and how much new road has been built. Then the public have to bid for one certificate, right? So currently, it costs about $55,000 just to buy a certificate, which in US will already buy you a car, any car. And the car itself is subjected to about 100% tariff. After 10 years, the car has to either be scrapped or you have to buy another certificate and keep the old car.
If cars are unaffordable, it's a different story when it comes to housing. 90% of the population live in public housing projects. Whether they're old or ultra-modern, the projects of the Housing and Development Board, the HDB, have everything and anything it takes to lead a full life without ever leaving the premises. This one, among the oldest in the city, houses restaurants, bakery, garage, childcare, services for the elderly, wheelchair access and public transit, and even a complaints office, if all that isn't enough.
It's a very conscious effort of the government to physically integrate the population. Right? So if you are in a public housing estate, the three major races, Chinese, Malays, and Indians, are mixed together in almost the same proportion of the composition of the national population.
Can you tell me about the range of HDBs? Because in other countries, you could think it would mean low-income housing.
Right. In most countries, you have situations in which all the poor people are grouped into a housing estate, and then fairly quickly the housing estate becomes essentially a slum or a squat, Whereas in Singapore, the houses are mainly sold to the residents for 99 years. So because they are owners, they also put a lot of money into maintenance. Because the government controls the planning of the whole town, the housing for the low income and for the middle class are physically mixed together. If you don't have a trained eye as an architect, you actually can't tell which block is poor, which block is not. And so physically, you don't get a kind of isolation of the poor.
What happens after 99 years?
We don't know, because no building has lasted 99 years yet. But when the HDB does tear down old blocks and build new ones, the tenants who are affected gets a new flat that starts from year 0. So the next 99 year begins again. One of the reasons why so many people can afford to buy the flat rather than rent is because of a financing mechanism that is interesting. You have a compulsory social security savings. So every employee in Singapore must save 20% of their income with a proportional contribution from the employer. And the government then loans some of that money to the housing board. So the housing board builds the housing, sells it to the Singaporean, right? And then the Singaporean uses their savings to pay for mortgage.
Their savings become a kind of a grant.
It's like, I'm a worker, I save money, right, in my compulsory savings fund. I buy a house from the housing board. I pay my monthly mortgage from my savings. And so it's just a closed circuit of transfer.
What percentage of the Singaporean income is used on housing monthly?
That actually is a very interesting question. You don't see how much you pay because it's all in the transfer, right? Once you sign to buy and pay mortgage, a lot of Singaporean actually doesn't know how much they pay for housing. But it is generally said to be below 25%.
Singaporeans have access to housing to match their income. For those with better means, there is The Pinnacle, the largest social housing project in the world. This enormous complex of 1,848 units on 51 floors has the largest roof garden in the world, a 3-kilometer exterior jogging trail on the 26th floor, basketball courts, and several family parks. Not exactly the typical social housing project. Singapore's distinctive architectural personality stands out through its originality and open-mindedness. The city is well-planned and well-designed. Yet until recently, its landscape was much more modest. Store owners often lived in small shop houses like these, now part of the local heritage.
Shop houses is when the family used to live above and the ground floor is used for businesses. On this street, most of these type of shop houses are actually used as homes, even on the ground level, and they have a front courtyard.
How long ago were they shop houses?
These ones are created around 1910 to 1920. And specifically, these are the most colorful shop houses in Singapore.
They're stunning.
They're stunning, yeah? What's interesting about the design, the fusion of influences from like the little air vents that's above the windows. Those are like Chinese motifs. They look like kind of like bats. Bats are supposed to be symbols of good luck for the Chinese. And of course, the influences like the European side using louvered windows. The shape is pretty obvious as such. Chinese deer, Chinese tiger, Chinese elephants. It's just quite unique to see them, across a whole row.
Yeah, there's
and
different-
everyone different pastel colors.
What is the value of a shop house?
No, it really depends what condition they are. But on Kun Sing Road, it's extremely sought after. So the most expensive one on this stretch is probably about $4.3 million.
To understand what Singapore has become, an aerial tour in miniature format. The model demonstrates the revolution this city has undergone. In 1965, the country was a mere 525 square kilometers. With the expansion on the surrounding waters, called land reclamation, it has now grown to more than 700 square kilometers. And Singapore plans to continue its growth with an additional 150 square kilometers by the year 2050.
Where did the coastline begin?
When Raffles first came to Singapore, there were people living in Singapore. And they were used to live by the beach, by the coastline, and also within the rivers. The coastline used to be like this shape. So if you follow the line of the road, the coastline used to be in this shape. And essentially everything from that road all the way through down south are land that didn't exist before.
There's a bit of a controversy about the sand that Singapore uses to
Yes.
reclaim land.
We have no choice. We actually have to buy sand and soil from overseas. We used to buy land and soil and stones even from Indonesia and Malaysia, but these days there's actually a ban on it.
Singapore has now become the largest importer of sand in the world. The problem is that this sand must be taken from somewhere. And dredging the seabed, according to many, greatly damages the local ecosystem.
How much land does the government plan to add?
There's no international standards how much land you can reclaim. If you already know that there's an arbitrary line running across the ocean and that's yours, there's no rules to say that you cannot reclaim land all the way out to the boundary. And certainly if we do that for the Straits of Singapore in the south, one of the busiest water passageway in the world, it may reduce our income because the ports would have less ability to have the big boats going through it.
If you look at photographs of Singapore in 1965, it looks like a fishing village. Is that what it was like?
Yes, it is. My grandparents were farmers. I was a child in the 70s, and for me to visit a shopping center, it was a special treat. So a huge cry of difference, and in one single generation, Singaporeans have been changed in their mindset. They're looking at the world for their dreams to be fulfilled. Well, back then, for my parents' generation anyway, it's all about survival. Huge changes.
Even with its frantic growth, Singapore has managed to save some of its treasures. One of these treasures is Chinatown, isolated in the midst of the construction.
Nice.
This is what I'm talking about. The old, the new money, the pots, all in one single shot. When you talk about protection of a neighborhood, what exactly are you trying to protect? The structure or the soul? Without the people, where is the soul? So this is one of the problems with the attempts at conservation in certain areas in Singapore, where all of a sudden the people felt that they were priced out of their reach, and the places that they grew up no longer is a place that they could live. And the skyscrapers are going to get even taller, and it's going to surround this place. And in time to come, who knows, even Chinatown might go. Awesome view, huh?
Awesome view.
Leaving Chinatown, we stumble across an unusual little shop. These are cardboard offerings to be burnt in homage to a lost one.
You can get things from like cash, clothing, gambling sets, dentures, sporting equipment, hairdressing products, gold or silver, washing machine, rice cooker, roast chicken, microwave oven, computers, golf set. Oh, this is so cool.
Tony's specialty, tours of the city through its culinary traditions. Tony's Food Walks.
You're famous for your food walks.
Yep.
How long do they usually last?
The food walk that I do, on average, is about 7 hours long.
Really?
By the time that we finish, usually it's like with a very, very full stomach.
What is a hawker market?
The hawker centers initially is the way they create a complex to take illegal hawkers from the street, put them in a central location where sewage and cleanliness can be maintained. And it is basically the pinnacle way of dining if you're in Singapore. If you come to Singapore and have not visited a hawker center, you've not been to Singapore. Hungry?
I'm starving.
Starving, okay.
Starving.
A true Singaporean will tell you that he knows where to find the best Singapore foods, and everyone is a food critic. So everyone has their whole favorites, and everyone seems to know where's the best chicken rice.
So where is the best chicken rice?
In this market, it's supposed to be Tian Tian chicken rice. And Tian Tian chicken rice, Hainanese chicken rice, boasts to have the best way, the best technique in making the chicken tender with a gelatin layer of fat in between, which is what we look for in a chicken rice. And here comes the part that's ironic, right? It's associated with a place Hainan. But if you go to Hainan in China, that dish do not exist. So basically, it's been taken on by the Hainanese migrants that came to Singapore.
And it has a life of its own.
Yeah, of course. So what makes a good chicken rice? First, the rice. Cook in chicken fat, cook in chicken broth. It's supposed to be individual pieces and it's supposed to be oily. Give it a go. The
Great.
aroma
Yeah.
comes from a herb called pandan.
And
Chicken
it's good.
stock and it's oily.
Yeah.
That's the correct way.
That's really good.
Chicken. A good Hainanese chicken, white chicken, what makes it special is that special gelatinous bit that is below. There is a special technique they use to cook this. So it's a steam, it's boiled, it's put into boiling water, and it needs to be plunged into ice cold water for 5 minutes. And that shocking change in temperature allows for the fat to all of a sudden be gelatinous and clear. So that's what a lot of people look for when it comes to Tian Tian. They're looking for that special jelly bit.
Oh wow, look at the lineup now at our chicken rice place.
Singaporeans are actually quite loyal to their food establishments. Once it's good, everybody comes.
There's even prizes for the best, the cleanest.
Absolutely. And there's a few ways to look at it. The ratings is actually about hygiene, it's actually about cleanliness, it's not about the taste in food. So very frequently, if you go to hawker centers, you'll find that the shops with an A rating, the best rating, an A rating, seems to have the shortest queue. Instead, it's actually the establishments that are B rating or even C rating. They are too busy to clean. That's why they don't win those awards. But anyways, those places are also just as good. In Singapore, eating out is actually fairly safe. Most of us on the weekdays will eat out maybe twice a day.
Tony advises me to go easy on the food.
We can't finish everything because there's so much more to taste in Singapore. If we eat everything, we're in trouble. Hi, Auntie, 又来了。
Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.
Food isn't the only defining element in the Singaporean way of life. The ubiquitous nature is definitely one of the city's most prominent attributes. Along with Rio de Janeiro, it has one of the only 2 urban rainforests in the world.
Singapore is like a city inside a garden. What percentage of Singapore is green space?
We have 4 natural reserves in Singapore, and we have 50 other parks that we are creating and redeveloping and maintaining with the assistance, of course, of the industry of the landscape in Singapore. It's a big coverage, which over the last 20 years has increased by 10%. At the same time as Singapore is economically booming, instead of seeing the greenery decreasing, it's increasing because it's possible to develop a country with the very high rate of development that we see in Southeast Asia, and at the same time to preserve the nature. I think this is very unique to this country.
With its urban density, it's surprising to see how Singapore integrates nature into everything. Or is it the other way around? Is everything integrated into nature? The Henderson Waves Bridge can probably answer that question.
Singapore has launched in 2008 the Index on Urban Biodiversity. It started in the 60s with Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who already visualized the frame of the garden city. So for us it's very important, this notion of biodiversity is really in the heart of our conservation policy.
Ecological diversity has always been paramount in Singapore. The Botanic Gardens, founded in 1859, illustrate the span of this diversity.
The Botanic Gardens is part of National Parks Board, is one of the flagship parks that we have here. And as such, Botanic Gardens is focused on the development of the garden itself, which is already a big thing. We have more than 3 million people coming every year, so we need to create this attractiveness. But it's also a very reputed botanic institution, which is in charge of research, education and conservation of heritage of the Southeast Asia. We have more than 100 arborists who every day go and check trees and report. Everything is documented and centralized. Every tree along the streets in Singapore is followed, you know, like a checkup, a medical checkup.
That's organization.
That's organization.
How many trees are there?
Along the streets of Singapore, you have more than 1.3 million which are cared by National Parks Board. Of course, you have more trees, much more trees inside the reserves, but which don't require so much care, because the trees along the road have to be particularly healthy, because they must not represent a hazard for the circulation.
As you may have noticed, nature in Singapore is pretty much everywhere. And where it doesn't grow on its own, the locals make it grow.
It sounds like self-sufficient green buildings.
Yes, we are really aiming towards green architecture, whereby all the buildings which are built in the city have to be self-sufficient in terms of energy. So we are developing alternate energy, of course. We are also capturing the water. It's raining regularly here, so we are just keeping it by the green roof that we install, which are capturing the water, which will be recycled inside the building. And we are also using these walls as a support to biodiversity, to reintroduce nature inside the city. All the horizontal spaces are occupied by activities. So the only remaining spaces for nature in the city are the walls.
Yeah, and even on the reclaimed land of the expanding city, that's prime real estate, things are carefully planned out to ensure that space is reserved for new parks.
Garden by the Bay is the new iconic park of Singapore. The first phase will be ready next year in June 2012. And this park is really the symbol of Singapore, to show that they really want to build a city in a garden, even downtown, where the land is very expensive. As you can see here, you have the Marina Bay. This is one of the most expensive places in Singapore, and instead of promoting doing buildings for business activity, instead they are building a park. This land, which is more than 100 hectares of land, will be allocated to this garden.
Hélène Toury is part of a team that proposed solutions to the local shortage of drinking water.
In front of us, we can see the Marina Barrage.
Well, it's interesting because that used to be the entry port to
Yeah, exactly.
Singapore, and now it's closed.
Historically, all the fishermen and commercial boats were entering through that part and going within Marina and over there Boat Quay. So that was really like the way that Singapore was built, but Singapore has a lack of water resources. So they want to make use and optimize the best as they can of all the water catchment that you have in front of you.
Singapore has no water table, which means no groundwater, and nowhere for the accumulation of rain that could compensate for this problem. Despite the heavy rainfall that comes with the climate, the city has to rely on its water reservoirs to survive. Canals like these catch the rainwater and redirect it to one of the many reservoirs scattered on the territory.
And where else do Singaporeans get water from? You have desalination plants?
Yeah, so you have desalination plant, which is about 20% today. There is Malaysia, of course, 40%, New Water is 30%, and the rest comes from the different reservoir, like Marina that you have in front of you.
How do you take sewage water and make it drinking water? What's the process?
So there is, first of all, this wastewater conventional treatment process that aims to treat the water, but after that, obviously, you can't drink it because there are still a lot of particles and ions inside the water. So there is 3 steps. The first one is microfiltration, so it's to remove all the particles. Then a second step called reverse osmosis. So you push the water at very high pressure into that big turbine. And so the last step is UV, in case there is anything less. So after that, it's safe to drink new water. So basically, there is between 70 and 80% of the new water, which is used for the industries. And it's cheaper, much cheaper than the water coming directly from Malaysia. So that's why also it's quite attractive for the economy, and especially for all these manufacturing areas, let's say, to have the new water.
So the government is already using new water in the water supply system in Singapore?
Yes, they do. For now, it's a very small percentage, but I think the objective is to achieve 2.5% by the next 2 or 3 years to come.
Is that unique in the world that you can take sewage water and turn it into drinkable water?
Well, the fact that they combine these technologies after a conventional wastewater treatment process and the application makes it very unique. Because today, new water is about 30% of the global water consumption in Singapore, which reach about 1.5 million cubic meters per day. So the fact that they're able to use recycled water at that level in their global daily consumption, this is very unique.
So now that we're almost on top, we can see Indonesia over there.
Yeah, there are 2 main islands, Bintan and Batam. And on the other side, we can almost see it. It's Malaysia. So everything that you see on the horizon, it's the Malaysian peninsula.
Hidden in the Johor Strait, which separates Singapore from Malaysia, a small island showcases what this extremely modern city was like just 50 years ago.
One being Pulau Tekong over there. So these are the 2 largest offshore islands for Singapore. And Pulau Ubin is the only one that remains totally undeveloped. It's like discovering what used to be Singapore. So we're just approaching the main jetty.
How far are we from Malaysia?
We are just a hop, skip, and jump away. Malaysia is just behind this island. So at the nearest point between Singapore and Malaysia, it's about 700 meters. So very, very close by. Ni hao. So we've lost so much as we developed into a modern city, developed city. A lot of nature was sacrificed. So now there's more emphasis on trying to retain some of what we have left. I work very closely with many of my conservation colleagues to try and retain some of these places.
This is like an open-air museum.
It is. And nobody designed it for visitors. It's just we're visiting what used to be the past. and that makes it more special. This was never designed for tourists.
This is the granite quarry?
This is the granite quarry. These granite quarries, once they were abandoned, the water rose with the rainwater, and they became bird paradises. Singapore never really had any natural resources. Granite and all was the only things that you can look at. I consider the only major natural resource for Singapore are humans.
How about rubber trees?
Well, rubber used to be tapped in Singapore in a big way right up to about 50, 60 years ago. Then they abandoned it because natural rubber industry crashed with the invention of the artificial or synthetic rubber using petroleum byproducts. This whole area on the eastern side of Ubin was a rubber estate, and much of it has reverted back into jungle. And a lot of rare animals still living here, like leopard cats and civet cats and mouse deer, call this home. To tap rubber, you have to come out very early in the morning, about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, because by 8 o'clock it gets too warm and the rubber doesn't flow, the latex.
You tap it just like you tap maple trees.
Well, you tap it at an angle, like so, and at the end of the tap, you'll put a metal shaft or a wooden shaft and a cup, and the latex will flow into this cup. Then when it stops flowing around 8 or 9, someone will come along, collect these cups and pour them into a bucket.
Rubber was Malaysia's economic driver in the early 1900s. Imported from Brazil by the British, the trees grew better here than in their home country. At one point, the Malay Peninsula produced more than 50% of the world's rubber and had become the exclusive supplier for the Ford Motor Company.
Now this is how rubber disperses. Rubber has fruits that either have 3 or 4 seeds. This one's a typical one of 3, and they disperse by explosion. Certain times if you hear these popping sounds, this thing will explode and fling the shells and the seeds all over. Here's an open one, so that's what the seed looks like.
This area is 100% preserved?
No, it's temporary because there are future plans for the island, which include housing estates and industrial estates and MRT lines and stuff. But more and more Singaporeans are beginning to realize the value of having such places. We are at the last Malay village in Singapore. All the other Malay communities, the villages are gone.
How old would you say this house
Well,
is?
this house probably over 100 years old. This community started maybe 120, 130 years ago. When the Malays first started, they were always at the coast of the rivers because they were mainly fishermen. And then as time passed and time changed, a lot of them moved inland because they could work fruit orchards and vegetable farms, the rubber estates, the granite quarries. And as their houses came in, initially they looked like this because this is your typical house that would be in a low-lying area so that when the tide comes in or it floods, you're above the water, right? On stilts. No animals can sneak in because you're on stilts.
Like those little lizards we saw later.
I don't think they're worried about that. I think in the old days they're more worried about bigger things. You know, Singapore used to have tigers and panthers. Here you work hard, you eat well, and you're stress-free. And it's a wonderful atmosphere. So a lot of the folk here live till very ripe old ages. Many of them are in their 80s, their 90s. Some of them live up to over 100.
Hello! How do you say hello?
Selamat pagi is good morning.
Selamat pagi?
Selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi! Time capsule.
Time capsule, absolutely.
Gotta get it. Terima kasih!
Terima kasih.
Bye-bye.
Hai, apa khabar? Selamat pagi. Boleh dia try satu? Dia betul-betul suka durian. Just felt this morning.
Do you have to wait till they fall? Because
You do have to wait
first of all,
till
for
they
them
fall.
to be ripe, and
Yes.
secondly, like so as
People
not to
don't
climb all
pluck
the way up
these
there.
fruits. They normally wait till they fall. So if it's a big tree and it falls, sometimes they split and then the animals go in. This is one seed with the flesh around it. You just take the flesh off the seed.
I love it.
Yeah, there you go.
Modern and eccentric, Singapore has the boldness to impose discipline and creativity in its urban development and architecture. Its inspiring cohabitation with everything green could give the rest of the world a lesson or two when it comes to sustainability. And best of all, Singaporeans, a mix of every origin in Asia, seem to have a thing for the collective well-being.